Welcome to Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm health integrationist Lena Berman with Jeff Fawcett, PhD. We come to you weekly with a critical, independent voice on the politics and practice of health. I'm often asked about how to protect young children from the nuclear isotopes that are drifting over from the Fukushima disaster. My answer always includes the revelation that although we can't control our exposure to this drift, there is another form of radiation over which we still can have some control. Nuclear radiation is ionizing like X-rays. Most people know about its dangers. What's less well known is that non-ionizing radiation, wireless technology, has almost identical health consequences, although with slightly different mechanisms. Interesting, too, is that human DNA can sometimes recover from the effects of ionizing radiation, but non-ionizing radiation damages DNA's attempt to repair itself, among its other disquieting health consequences. Since the government, the military, and the telecoms have a big stake in blanketing the entire planet in wireless broadband, plans for which are progressing rapidly, it's time people got educated on how to protect themselves and future generations. Additionally, trees and other creatures we share this planet with are affected, too. Too bad they won't be able to benefit from what you will hear today in this hour, all those little creatures. But we will. Stay tuned for Electronically Quiet Home. My guest today is Michael Neuert, who holds a bachelor's degree in engineering from the University of Wisconsin and a master's degree in psychology from Sonoma State University in California. He's also a California state licensed electrical contractor and has been testing and reducing electromagnetic fields for clients since 1992. Michael's work has included the design of special low EMF products, the shielding of various EMF sources from smart meters to electrical transformers, the design and the installation of special low EMF electrical wiring systems for homes and offices, the troubleshooting and repair of wiring issues caused by high electromagnetic fields and buildings, and extensive writing about the subject. Michael has over 22 years of practical experience working with clients who report sensitivity to electromagnetic fields and is himself a person who is sensitive to EMFs. He is presently training several apprentices and has authored many articles and websites, including emfcenter.com and emfinfo.org, and we'll put those links on our website. Welcome to you, Michael. Thanks for coming into our studio.
Yes, hello, Lena. It's a pleasure to be here today.
So, one of the things that people are constantly confused about is this issue of we talk about EMF, and that's electromagnetic frequencies, but within that, there's all these other frequencies that are irritating. So I think people forget that just electricity itself can be irritating, and then we have the radio frequency now that's being layered on here. So why don't you give us a little quick lesson about low-level electric fields, what they are, how they're created, and why the body is so sensitive, how it's an antenna.
Oh, great. Yeah, the term electromagnetic field is a broad term, includes a lot of different kinds of EMFs. And the types of EMFs that have been around the longest for us are the kinds related to electricity. So this is magnetic fields and electric fields from wiring and power lines and transformers, things like that. The kind of thing that back in the 70s and 80s, there were studies starting to find health effects, for instance, in homes near power lines, more leukemia in children, things like that. That's one whole type of EMF. And then there's another whole range of EMFs that we call radio frequencies. And you'll hear the abbreviation RF for radio frequencies. That is another whole set of EMFs that are used for communication usually. The EMF can be modulated in certain ways that you can carry information. It used to be that most of the radio frequencies were analog type of relatively smoother, kind of cleaner, more natural type of fields. But these days everything's going digital, and the digital radio frequencies appear to be much more troublesome for the body. A lot of people report much more problem with the radio frequencies when they're digital. Even if they're not that strong, it doesn't take a lot of strength for a digital type of field to cause biological effects.
So isn't this really radar? Isn't this all this wireless stuff essentially radar?
Radar is a type of radio frequency, yeah. So originally that was the original radio frequency, that in AM radio. So, but now the frequencies have been really filled in. So you have not just TV and radio and ham radio and radar, but you have all kinds of other digital technologies, cell phone frequencies, Wi-Fi frequencies. Some of the frequencies are relatively common that are opened up for all kinds of devices that use in the home. Some are more specialized and reserved for certain military purposes, emergency, police, fire, things like that too.
The other thing to remember is that people often say, but the sun is electromagnetic and we're wired, literally we're wired to be able to handle this. It's natural. So what's the problem here? But a lot of it has to do with the way these fields are being delivered. You know, they're pulsed, they're cycling, and there are also many layers of them where there wasn't before.
Yes. In fact, one of the reasons that the artificial EMFs that we create, things like radar or the Wi-Fi for a wireless router, for instance, these are artificially created EMFs, but the Earth and our environment has some natural electromagnetic fields, and our body picks up some of those natural electromagnetic fields. Not well understood, but we do know there are studies showing that, for instance, the pineal gland is influenced by some of the frequencies that are very close to electrical power frequencies. So you have a 60 hertz field from electrical power, perhaps competing with some of the natural signals of the planet, like what's called, some people might have heard something called the Schumann resonance. And that's a natural magnetic frequency of the Earth. Very low exposure level, but our brains do pick it up and the pineal gland responds to it. And it's part of the body's circadian rhythm cycle, determining night from day.
Well, and in fact, people who are sensitive sleep better when they take melatonin, usually because of this disruption that's happening. Yeah.
Yes.
So there's also another. Well, the other thing is that these extremely low frequencies, from what I can tell from the years that we've been covering this, are difficult because the body is electric, and it's very difficult for the body to discern when it's a low-level frequency that's constant, whether it's self or other. So it has a kind of autoimmune disrupting effect, which is also not well understood yet, but it's definitely happening.
Yes, that's where the old model of how all these different kinds of electromagnetic fields could affect us was a thermal model, which had to do with the stronger the field, the more energy, the more it heats the body. But it turns out all the studies now are showing non-thermal effects. It's more like interference. It's like you're driving your car, you're listening to the radio, and all of a sudden something else is interfering with that signal. So it's more of an interference type of effect having to do with our bodies are very bioelectronic. But this is something that isn't, the scientific sort of mind hasn't grasped that model yet. It's pretty much on this thermal model.
Yeah, it's starting to, though. There's all these 1,800 new studies in the revised Bioinitiative report, which is available at bioinitiative.org. if people want to read them. And there's lots of new studies showing lots of harm in lots of different ways from these fields. So one of the things that also is irritating is that I remember Ole Johansson from Sweden, who is the dermatologist who started doing work on electrosensitivity and started testing people and noticed that their body reacted, whether they physically reacted or not, that there are heat shock proteins that are developed, that people go into a stress response even if they're not feeling it. And in Sweden, they noticed just the adding electricity to the rural areas that the incidence of cancer went way up.
Yes.
And then when they added AM radio, it went up, and then it went up even higher. So each blanket has caused increase, and they do pay attention in some parts of Europe. But there's also something called dirty electricity. Of course, we've covered a lot on the show. But you're using the metaphor of Ebola and AIDS. Yeah,
the dirty electricity is a confusing issue, and it's rather complicated. So I think of a lot of the approaches right now for dirty electricity are to put in filters, which can be very helpful in some situations. But I think of it as kind of like if you have if you have an AIDS or an Ebola virus. If you have the disease, yes, you want to do something to treat that. But a lot of the health around something like a virus like that is avoiding the contact in the first place. And it turns out that one of the main ways that dirty electricity gets from the wiring system around you, the wires, the cords, the computer, is through the air, through a low frequency field. So typically, it's both the magnetic field and the electric field from the wiring, but a lot of it's the electric field. So when you put in a filter for the dirty electricity, you're reducing the dirtiness that's coming along with this electric field. But if you can actually get rid of the electric field, then the dirtiness is not getting out of the wires too. So a lot of times people who are sensitive to this kind of thing, or if you're looking at your health, it can be helpful to actually reduce the fields in addition to trying to clean up the dirtiness aspect.
Yeah, well, that's where you come in, but the problem is that increasingly it's impossible for people to do that because they're being exposed to things that they don't have control over. I mean, there's been an exponential increase of the number of towers, and they're now putting new and different forms of wireless broadband and things on that are blanketing areas. So yes. I noticed that I never felt good around those filters until all of our electricity, because of the smart meters that are being put in everywhere, suddenly became very dirty, and I couldn't live in. I just couldn't handle the house at all. But when I put the filters in, they work beautifully. And we had Dave Stetzer on, and they're some people, as you say, don't feel good around them. Most people I know feel better once things get really bad.
Yes, so, they can be helpful. So a lot of times, if a person is helped, this is what I find in my experience with people. Not always, but a lot of times, if putting in the filters helps, because that's cleaning up the electric fields, reducing those electric fields helps even more. And the nice thing about the electric fields, in the sense of what you can do about it, is this is typically the EMF that you have the most control over, because most of it is your own wiring and things near you. So it's not so much, this case, the cell tower or the power line outside. It tends to be these wires in your wall, for instance. That might be, for instance, just a foot from your head and near your bed where you're sleeping.
Okay, so there's some remediation that can be done even if you're getting bombarded from the outside.
Yes.
Okay, that's good to know.
One of the ways we think about it, too, is sometimes when you have one kind of EMF you can control, you try to reduce some of the EMFs that you can, so you reduce your total exposure load.
Yeah. I want to move on to earthing because it's a very complicated issue. The idea of putting yourself in contact with the Earth's natural field is a good idea, except that increasingly the fields of the Earth are now polluted with all this stuff. Unless you live way out in the middle of nowhere, your field is. But before I do that, let's just very quickly say that this is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman, and Jeff Fawcett is sitting by here, and we are doing a show in studio with Michael Neuert, Neuert, who helps people fix homes and businesses and things, helps to reduce some of these fields and help you figure out what might be causing problems. The show is called the Electronically Quiet Home. So we're moving on to this idea of earthing. And as I said, since the Earth is now polluted with towers and smart meters and everything's going to ground, why don't you give us your opinion about that? Because people are always saying, should I buy one of these earthing mats? I tried one. It made me sick.
Yes. So earthing, like a lot of things with electromagnetic fields, earthing is something that it actually is almost an amazing healing miracle for some people. And for other people, I have several clients who feel it is the cause of their electromagnetic sensitivity.
Wow.
And it actually makes sense because there are good places and times to earth, and there may be bad places to earth. So basically, I think of two types of earthing. There's what I would call natural earthing. This is where you go to a clean environment where there aren't many fields around you.
Finding that place.
Right. You put your feet on the ground. This is something in all the 22 years I've been working with, way back, even 22 years ago, my first clients were saying, oh yeah, the best thing is I go out in the backyard, I put my feet in the ground, and I go to the park, but there's places I can't go. I can't go to the park there where there's power lines, and I can't go where there's that cell tower.
That's right.
So it turns out, natural earthing in a clean environment tends to be very healing for a lot of people.
I agree.
And then there's artificial earthing, where you try to do earthing, but often inside a building. You try to bring an electrical connection from the ground, from the earth, to you. It can be a pad at your feet that's conductive, or a conductive bed pad, things like that. And what I've found, in my experience with my clients, is that if they're doing this in a very clean environment where the radio frequencies are quite low, where the electric fields, these ELF electric fields, are quite low, then often earthing in the house helps too. But once you start having significant electric fields or radio frequencies in the house, which is typical for most houses, you're grounding your body in that sense. You're actually making yourself a little more like a lightning rod. A lightning rod is basically a conductive material. Your body's conductive, which is connected to a wire to the earth, so that stray electricity and power from the lightning strike will be channeled through that to the ground.
This is really good.
So when you earth yourself, if there's a field around, you can actually be the collector of that field. And when you do a body voltage measurement, which is a particular kind of test, you can get fooled to thinking you're in a clean environment, because when you ground yourself, you will not measure a body voltage. But if you had the right instrument, you would actually measure a current flowing across your skin to the place where you're making contact to the earthing mat and to the earth. And there's actually a little current there. And you could do that. You could set up an experiment, put in a little current meter there and measure that current. It's small, but the biological currents in our body are small. So this is big for the body. So that's kind of what I find. There's other things involved, but generally you have to be really careful if you're doing an artificial earthing. And so I've had several clients. Some have written me and they've kind of testified and say, how can you sell these products? Well, the products work great in some cases, but in other cases, it's actually probably turned them into antenna, more fields kind of collecting on them. And it's kind of like they're being the garbage can for the fields in the air, draining the air, and it's kind of going through them. See, that's the way a lot of the shielding works for some of these fields. It's like the garbage cans.
That's what I was thinking, the shielding.
It picks up and this way you're shielding perhaps other things. If you stand, like a person's earthing, and you stand near them, your field will be probably less because they're collecting a little more.
So that's a better shield than a piece of aluminum foil.
If you get enough people standing around you.
You just have to put somebody who's earthing on your head.
Yeah.
Okay. So well, that actually does flow nicely into the idea of shielding, because some people well, first of all, I have to say, are you finding that there are any places that people live now that isn't like in some place where there's less population or something, that people have a clean environment? Because I haven't been to that place.
It depends on the degree.
Okay.
So for very sensitive people, it's difficult, getting very, very difficult to do, moving in the country, in a valley, in a canyon kind of thing, right? Trying to find these unique places, and even that's tricky because you never know what's going to happen down the road.
Yep, exactly.
Then there's the worst case here in San Francisco. You're near the Sutro Tower. You've got all the greatest Wi-Fi repeaters and everything. So there's quite a variation. So typically, as you get away from the dense urban areas where there's so many cell towers every 2 blocks kind of thing, you get into better environments. But still, when you're in a standard neighborhood, residential suburb, you typically, even if you're maybe a mile from a cell tower, typically you have your neighbors' wireless and the smart meters. So it becomes basically the rough formula is to get away from the EMFs that are around you, distance from neighbors. So often you tend to go a little more rural, as much rural as you're comfortable with space between your house and other houses, and that's the first step. And the denser you get, the worse. So the worst case, and what really gets trouble, is people who are living in in apartment buildings and condominiums where you're sharing walls with other people.
Well, and there's a bank of smart meters on the building, too.
And there's a bank, I have a client like that. She's sharing the wall. All the smart meters are on her end of the condo. And even though we did a shielding job on her place before she moved, she said, let's try shielding it. The shielding wasn't good enough. She needed to move. Because with all of those sources, shielding is never 100%.
No, and in fact, some people get worse when you shield.
Shielding is tricky, and it gets into the same issues with earthing. Sometimes it works better than others.
Well, and there's also the question of if you shield, you have to be very careful that the inside of your building, you're not using anything that's generating radio frequencies. And if you just put in the new LED lights, there used to be the LEDs that first came out were pretty quiet.
Yes.
And now they've changed the circuitry, and most of them are dimmable. You do not want a dimmable one. You can sometimes find a non-dimmable. But even so, I like the AM radio test myself because I know that that's a frequency that I react to. It's a very high frequency. You take an AM radio, you tune it off the station to the top of the dial, and you hold it up to something, and if it starts shrieking, you know that you've got this very high
it's a
frequency.
Noisy source, yeah.
It's a really high frequency. And the LED lights, the new ones, are extremely noisy. So if you put them in, you want to have them way above your head, so you have drop-off from them. But it's just people, a lot of people are still using CFLs. They're still using compact fluorescent bulbs, which are extremely irritating.
Typically worse than the LEDs.
And then if you shield, they're about the same almost now. The LEDs are getting pretty bad, but they're really bad, the compact fluorescents. But then you put in shielding, and you've got all this stuff that can't get out. It's bouncing around and reflecting back at you.
It'll actually depend. So this is where shielding gets a little tricky because these different electromagnetic fields react different depending on the frequency. It's kind of like the different colors of the rainbow. So a lot of if you think of the radio frequencies in kind of two general compartments, there's a lower frequency end, which is like AM radio and ham radio. Then you have a higher frequency end, which is all the digital things. So when you start getting these higher frequencies, the shielding material will typically be a reflector, like a mirror. It also happens in the lower frequencies, but when you get in the lower frequencies, there's more interacting with the shielding. So sometimes more and more the shield even becomes like a secondary source. So what happens with some of the lower frequencies, and this especially happens when you get down into what we call the ELF, the power frequencies for electricity. But the lower frequency radio frequencies they'll interact more with typically a metal, that's the shield, and the shielding material will act like a new antenna and re-radiate. It's called the secondary antenna effect. So what happens is a lot of times in shielding situations, if you have, say, a bed shield around you, kind of a canopy around your whole bed,
those are being sold,
you'll typically get fairly good reductions in the center of that canopy, maybe 95% reduction, maybe 99% reduction. But as you go toward the edges, you might actually get higher fields at the edges. So for instance, a lot of canopies are kind of small and your head is there and maybe 6 inches away is the canopy. Your head, in some cases with a canopy, can get a higher exposure just because of the canopy. So shielding is never quite perfect. And then you add in the lower frequencies, you really need to ground that shielding material, because if you don't ground it, it tends to actually amplify the fields. So it gets kind of complicated. And what I find a lot of cases when shielding doesn't work, a lot of times it isn't grounded properly. And also, it gets difficult. And just like you said, once you shield a room really well, and you do what we call a Faraday cage, where you have the shielding material, ceiling, walls, windows, you can't have any opening, basically. You keep the fields out. But the problem is, then the higher frequencies, they tend to bounce back. So if you have anything inside, even a computer with just a little bit of the radio frequency that comes from the electronics that's inherent in anything electronic,
especially computers,
that doesn't go out the window like it used to. Now it gets reflected back. So it's hard to predict how you're going to do in a shielded room.
Well, and a lot of people say, I'll just wear shielded clothing. I'll just wear these shirts, these underwear things that have fabrics that have metal threads in them. No one will notice that I'm wearing it. I'm going to wear things on my hands when I'm using my computer. I'm going to wear a hat.
Yes.
But as you pointed out, which is very important to know, is that can cause the fields to collapse on your skin.
Yeah, so a couple of things there. If you're doing a shielded clothing, one of the first problems is it's only a partial covering. One of the most effective things that I've seen when you're doing clothing is the head. I have a client who's a doctor, very affected, and he found that if he actually wears kind of like a beekeeper's hat.
Yeah, that's what I've heard, beekeeper hat.
It's a little more than just like a cap on your head. It's got to come over his face and down to about his shoulders. And he can pretty much manage with that because he's found out that it's the exposure to his head that seems to bother him. So for some people that might not be enough coverage, for some it might. But besides the trying to cover as much as you can, the other issue is it'll depend what kind of environment you're in. If you're in an environment in a building with a lot of electric fields, this is these ELF, the power wiring electric fields again, that shielding will interact with that field also. You can make it worse. So sometimes if there's high electric fields, you're amplifying it, and that's why sometimes the things feel better for worse. And one of the things that helps a lot of people, if you do wear some kind of shielding clothing, make sure you wear something between, a layer of clothing between the shield and your skin.
Oh, good idea.
Something that, so you don't have electrical contact.
Yeah.
Because once you touch the material, it's kind of like you've made your skin bigger. It's kind of, you're a bigger surface now, you can collect more fields. So you're actually kind of making yourself a bigger collector rather than shielding yourself. So that's something that's kind of critical in a lot of cases. You wear, ideally you'd be wearing plastic because that's not conductive to electricity, but that's going to feel awful. So typically some kind of dry cotton material. Once you start perspiring and it gets wet, it'll start to conduct electricity.
Yeah, the moisture does. But the other problem here is that wiring now increasingly is carrying so much data and so much stuff on it from both PG&E's smart meters.
Yes.
Well, they're all over the world, smart meters. So smart meters are carrying it, and they're putting smart meters in rural areas where there's no way that there's no infrastructure, so they have to come out and read it. But it still carries it on the lines. It still carries RF.
Yes.
And then there's just everything in the house and all the wiring, your phones, even if you have a landline, are carrying as an antenna. They become antennas.
Yes.
So the whole house lights up.
Yes.
Because of the ambient exposures from what's happening with the power. The power is no longer clean. It's not. It used to be that PG&E Power, because they condition their lines a little bit, used to be pretty clean stuff, and then they start putting in these smart meters, and wham! I'm sure when you go in and start, I can just walk into a room where if there's a smart meter nearby, my heart starts pounding. That's how I notice it. But you must be finding just off the charts, because that's apparently what other people like Cindy Sage have found doing meter reading, using meters, not being a meter reader.
Yeah, you're talking about dirty electricity. It's a really important issue. We've always had the dirty electricity is basically where you have radio frequencies that are being carried along the power line frequency fields. So normally, and most of the radio frequencies are being introduced by something electronic. So a big source is the inverters for solar systems, for instance.
Yeah,
they're some of the worst.
Yep.
But anything, that's just a big piece of electronics. But any electronics, the power supply for your computer, the power supply for the LED bulbs, the electronic power supply for the fluorescent lights, all these little electronics tend to take little sips of electricity in a way that tends to cause radio frequencies to be added to the signal. And in some cases, that's less of an issue if the fields coming from the wiring and things around you are fairly low. But if those fields are high, like they are in certain situations, then that amount of dirty electricity is high too. One of the interesting things will be that, in fact, like if you do a measurement and you look with an oscilloscope at some of the dirty electricity signals on the wiring, the voltage on the wires, if you then look at a person who's in that electric field from those wires, you'll see those same radio frequencies on their skin as the field collapses onto their skin. Because the human body is actually an ideal antenna for picking up a lot of these electromagnetic fields, especially the electric fields from wiring and power lines. The body's actually a perfect antenna, picks it up very well.
No doubt about it. We're going to have to do a brief musical break, but before, what I want to cover when we come back, because we did call this the electronically quiet house or home, is we certainly should go over. You can explain, I think, or you can send people to a link to find out how to make a body voltage meter for themselves to do this, and then of course we've discussed the AM radio test. So when we come back, maybe we'll hit that, and then we'll start talking about what kind of control, practically speaking, people have in their homes. Now we understand what they need to control for. This is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman. I'm in studio with Jeff Fawcett and Michael Neuert, who is helps people remediate the electromagnetic fields in their homes and offices and things like that, and helps them to make a healthier environment. We're going to play a little music here, and we will be back with this discussion of the electronically quiet home in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. Visit our website, yourownhealthandfitness.org, all spelled out, for easier extended access to our over 600 archive shows with our library card feature. Find a free stream of this week's show, our book, and lots more at yourownhealthandfitness.org. If you need to reach us, please do it by email at admin, ADMIN, at yourownhealthandfitness.org. We are in studio with Michael Neuert, and we are doing a show called the Electronically Quiet House. Michael, did you want to give out some websites for people to look at?
Sure. My informational website is emfinfo.org, and that has basically information about EMFs, some things you can do. One of the things on there that might be interesting people is there are directions about how to make your own body voltmeter. So it's a relatively inexpensive thing to test because you can use a standard electrician's voltmeter from a place like Radio Shack or a Home Depot and add a few wires and make yourself a body voltmeter. And so that's something that's usually affordable, and that directions to do that are free on that website.
Yeah, the really important part there is to ground the grounding on it.
The grounding is important. Almost, whether you're shielding, earthing, the grounding, the way you ground it. We were getting into more details about shielding. It's even what you ground to that can make a difference. So that's a site that has some information, and also I have a site, emfcenter.com. That is where there's information about renting the test meters, buying the test meters, that kind of thing, and some of the work I do.
So the first one again is
emfinfo.org.
So the emfinfo.org is an informational website,
yes,
and the other one is actually commercial.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
mm-hmm.
Great. And lest we can go back to the body voltmeter, I guess, then, and grounding, some more details about grounding. But maybe first, if you agree, we should move on to just what things people actually have control over. I mean, we're discovering that it's very hard. Like, we had a refrigerator die, never at the best time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really worried because all the other sort of researchers and experts that we talked to said, oh, well, all the appliances are being equipped with antennas now, and they're all more digital. Appliances in general are using digital controls now. They all have these ice makers with digital. It's very digital.
Yes.
So I was really worried. What happened was I just took a risk, and I called, not to give them a free pitch, but I just chose to call Best Buy. I'd called around, and I called Best Buy, and I got a really smart young man in the appliance thing, and I said, I want an electromagnetic, just a regular electric refrigerator. I want no digital, nothing. I want the fewest circuit board. I want a really quiet refrigerator. And he said, well, in fact, there is one. There's this Whirlpool and this and that, and it's an Energy Star. And we thought, oh, great. Mm-hmm. And we got it, and it is very quiet. It's really good. I mean, it both is fairly quiet. But beyond that, it's with the AM radio test anyway, it's pretty good. It doesn't seem to have antennas or anything, but they outfitted the inside of the refrigerator with LED bulbs, and they made it look like a wet bar, it was very beautiful inside. But as soon as I opened the refrigerator and they all went blue, 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 they all lit up, I got a wave, like a headache that almost knocked me on my feet. And I thought, okay, and they can't be removed. But Dr. Fawcett here, who's brilliant, just sat and thought about it for a second, and he said, well, we just have to tape over the thing that makes them go on the door. Oh, yes. So we have a dark refrigerator, but if you have light in the room, you can see what's going on. And now it's totally silent. So what I'm saying is, when you buy appliances, you do have to make a point of explaining to people that you don't want all this extra stuff because, among other things, they're trying to put smart meter-enabled things in there. Because don't you need to check your refrigerator from your cell phone?
Right. It's like everything, it's getting trickier to be clean with electromagnetic fields. So before we even get into like how you would test to see what you have, the number one thing is when you're getting anything is to make sure, the big thing is to make sure it doesn't have any wireless in it. There's a lot of, so this would be wireless perhaps for things like the refrigerator, using maybe Zigbee or some system to talk to the smart meter. There's a lot of choices yet, but it's like finding a wired router now rather than non-wireless router. Yeah. They're still available, but people will think you'll say I don't want a wireless router, and they'll still hear, oh, you want a wireless router. I've been
you
through
have
that
to
with
keep
Comcast
saying it
myself.
over and over and over. Well, the other problem is that some things are both wireless and non-wireless.
Yes.
They say it can be turned off. Can it be turned off?
In some cases, but I wouldn't trust that.
Yeah.
I would say about good 50% of the time when people say they don't have any wireless in their house, they do.
Yes.
And they'll say, oh, but Comcast said they turned it off. Well, it's not off. Then we actually went through it with a client in Oakland. Comcast turned it off. A minute later, it was back on. What it was is they were turning off the software, not the hardware. So a lot of things that I have
you have
both,
to be an expert.
Right. Well, it comes down to with the radio frequencies, since a lot of things, the easiest thing to do is just to really take care initially to make sure there's no wireless in it. When you get a router without wireless. When you get a modem without wireless. Because otherwise you're always wondering, is it on, is it off? And you can still usually find that kind of equipment if you're looking. That's the biggest thing to avoid the wireless in the house.
And the other thing that's very important here is that if you get a computer, it comes outfitted with all kinds of wireless stuff that has to be removed if you don't want it. So we did find with Apple computers that if you go to an Apple dealer, the place that repairs them, it doesn't have to be Apple, they can remove the board that makes it. The airport card. Yeah, the airport card. Mm-hmm. And they can unplug the Bluetooth. Now, in laptops, they cannot.
Right.
So you have to turn it off in your system folder. Does it turn off, Michael?
Usually it does. What I've seen with laptops has been pretty good. You put it on the airplane mode and it's off. Where I've seen trouble is with smartphones
they don't turn off.
And iPads.
Yeah, they do not turn off.
Sometimes I went through with a client where with an iPad, and they said, no, I got it off. And then I tested, it was on. And then I tested again. And they went through six levels of trying to turn it off. And actually, it turned out they had never turned it off. Because there's different levels of off.
Generally not. They generally don't turn off. They keep looking for a signal.
Right. If you really know what you're doing, you can know how to set them so they don't check with the cell tower, so they don't check with the Wi-Fi.
Oh, you have to tell them exactly what not to do.
But you have to know what you're doing. So what I try to do is not have any of those devices, of course. But if you do, it's getting so complicated that unfortunately you almost have to have some kind of basic radio frequency detector meter, because it's otherwise you're just always guessing. Especially if you're a sensitive person, you almost have to check to make sure things are really off. You can't trust
what they say.
Yes, because a lot well-meaning people will not even know. They won't know that the radio frequency is still being emitted by the hardware, even though the software is making it unintelligible.
So basically, don't buy anything you can't return in 30 days.
Yeah.
So you can test it.
Right. Very good. And then, of course, when you're getting into things beyond radio frequency devices, anything that might have radio frequencies, you're trying to basically go with the simplest, like you did with your refrigerator. You're trying to kind of go back to the basics. Mm-hmm. A big issue is cars. Cars are really trouble. So
people ask me all the time. So please do talk about cars before we get to the house. If you can.
It's difficult here. I recommend again that you go in with a couple test meters as you test cars, because once you have the car, it's very difficult to do shielding or stop things that are coming from the car. But the general idea usually is the simpler the car. I know it's getting tough to do that, but really sensitive people are still looking for old used cars that they keep going. Or you try them out and a lot of times the better cars will be like where the engine's a little farther away. When you're really squished in, there's more things close to you. But these days, there's also all kinds of radio frequency emitters. I've seen cars where they have, even the temperature sensor control in the ceiling is a little RF device, because they don't run the wires anymore for a lot of things. They just put a little RF device in there. So, it's unfortunately that's kind of the way the world is. You a lot of times the more bare bones kind of model will have less of that stuff.
Well, some car companies are charging you more if you want all that stuff, but I see that even their temperature things. So I know that the small Prius, the new small Prius it's more money if you buy Bluetooth and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. But now I see there are these discrete other things. Now we have also the question of a hybrid is basically an inverter. You're driving around in an inverter, and as you said, solar inverters, you have to be really... I will say that I have found, I can say this, and I don't mind saying it on the air, that we did find an inverter that is quieter. It is more expensive and it is more complex, but it is brilliantly quiet.
Yes.
And this is off-grid, the Sunny Island. And if it's in-grid, you use a Sunny Boy. And they are outstanding.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not getting paid. I just first had an inverter I couldn't stand. Now I have an inverter I can. So it's that much difference. It's quite remarkable.
It's good to hear that. Electronics can be made quieter.
Yes, we talked to Dave Stetzer about this, and he said there's a white paper, he actually sent it to us, that shows how to make an inverter quiet, and it's just an adjustment, somebody who knows how to can open it up. But these are already quieter, but you can't make electricity without fields. There's going to be some fields.
Right.
So those cars, those hybrids, are making electricity.
Yes.
So they're going to cause a lot of fields there.
So hybrids tend to be more trouble because there's more possibilities. But regular cars have a lot of issues too, because even a regular engine is running on basically an electrical spark, which is a little electromagnetic explosion, and there's an alternator. So all cars tend to be an EMF issue, but the hybrids tend to be worse. Yeah.
And what about a straight electric car? If it's just electric, is it generating electricity, or is it? How's that?
You have an electric motor, so electric motors make fields.
Motors make fields. Ouch. So we have to wait.
When
for
you have
some
electricity,
new
you're going to have these things. It's just a matter of how cleanly it is done. And like what I've seen with things like the ballasts for electronic fluorescent lighting, or for LEDs, they can be done much cleaner too, but it adds just a little bit of cost. And so typically as these things get into big production, they might take that nickel and save that nickel, So typically when it gets into big production of devices, they do enough reducing of the noise so that they're not upsetting the FCC standards for interference with other electronics, but they're not doing anything beyond that. So things tend to be dirty by our human standards.
So we've talked about these sort of general approaches to looking at the fields in your house and in your car and your office and that. So not having a smart meter, opting out. Just to let people know also, if you are making less than, I think it's $31,800 a year, you can qualify for the CARE program. And that makes it not expensive at all to get rid of a smart meter. Otherwise, they are going to charge you. And they're trying to do other nasty... The politics of this, which is not what we're talking about today, but we will cover it, is so awful that it's not even... There's no illusion anymore of a democracy in this country. The people who are in charge of the new guy at the Public Utilities, Cal Public Utilities, is a real villain. And the guy, FCC, I mean, it's all just terrifying. I should just mention that you're listening to Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman. Jeff Fawcett is sitting here by me. And Michael Neuert is our guest. He is a sort of an electrical engineer, you could say, contractor. And he works in remediation to help people reduce fields in the house and the home and protect themselves. We've given out 2 websites for you. Could you give them out again?
Oh, sure. EMFcenter.com is the commercial website, and EMFinfo.org is the informational website.
Great. So we've gone through some of these things.
Could I mention something?
Oh, you always can, of course.
Just finishing with the radio frequencies, what a lot of people don't realize is, yes, there's smart meters, your neighbors, perhaps yours, but a lot of people don't realize their own radio frequency sources, and the most frequent one is the cordless phones in the house. God. And especially the DECT phones, which are fairly powerful digital type of technology. So if you want to make your home cleaner, the most important thing probably is to get rid of the cordless phones, go back to the old corded phones. I like the corded speaker phones, like the big old person phones that sit there.
No, but they're still being AT&T and Panasonic both make really good.
And the other thing to really help people be aware of is that the wireless internet, the wireless routers, are something. Even if you're only using it 5 minutes a day, the router is emitting the RF all the time.
And that's where the most health effects are being caused.
And one of the worst things I've seen related to that is pretty much now, whether you're getting whether you're getting a cable service for your internet or over the telephone line, those companies typically will have a package where you get some kind of gateway piece of equipment. That gateway, whether it will typically be a wireless system, even if you put all wires up to it, you have an Ethernet cable go into it and a TV cable, the box itself will still do wireless.
That's scurrilous.
So after we're dealing with the cordless phones, the next thing is to work with your internet company, whether it's the cable company or the telephone company, to get equipment that's not wireless. You can do some shielding of the box, but the shielding is never perfect, and it's much better. You can still do it.
It's carried on the line.
Yeah, right. And it's another interesting thing. But what I've also seen is when you have one of these gateways. This is the place where the internet signal is coming in from the utility. It also has electricity coming in from the power company.
That's right.
So this is one of the places where things kind of tend to get mixed up. So what I've seen, and I've had some houses I've worked on, we've got all the fields really low. The wiring fields are low. We've done shielding. We've done a great job of all the different EMFs. Lo and behold, person picks up their telephone, and I'm actually reading a body voltage of a half a volt or a volt on it, and it turns out it was coming through this wireless gate, or this wired, even a wired gateway in this case, coming through that gateway. And then the low frequency power line signal was coupling onto the phone line wire.
Absolutely.
So it's like the dirty electricity can go both ways. You can have high frequencies going onto your low frequency fields, but then you can have these low frequencies going to the high frequency fields. So unfortunately, it's the way things are going. So for some people who are really sensitive, sometimes you just go back to the old phone system and don't even have an Ethernet type of phone. But I never know how that's going to go. It's hard to predict how these things are going to cross over.
Don't use a VoIP. Don't use a voice over internet protocol.
Yeah.
Oh, no, you're right. Oh, no, they're very noisy because the adapter. The other thing is that the more AC adapters you have in your house, the more noise you're going to have in general. And if your phone, corded or otherwise, is a caller ID phone, you've got another AC adapter.
Yes,
so the more of those. And the other problem is the DECT phones or any of the cordless phones have a base station, so you've got an antenna in your house. And if you're trying to shield, it's reflecting stuff all over. So
you can't shield if you're doing those things.
It's a tower. You've got a tower. And also, people are buying boosters and putting them in their house to increase their... It's not enough that the wireless goes 350 feet. They have to have it even stronger and bigger. Right. So you've got a tower in your house. And then the DECT phones, it turns out, according to the research that's coming out, there's a kind of concomitant reaction between the wireless router, your smart meter, and all these other fields. And when you put the DECT phone on there too, it increases the other ones exponentially. So it makes everything stronger, and people get sicker. And anecdotally, I am seeing a lot of cancer happening very fast in people, and young people with no history. So you don't want to constantly... The other thing that I've noticed that you've pointed out to me, too, that was very important to know about is that, oddly enough, if you're on a nice, quiet, corded phone, which is hard to find these days because the phone companies are using all kinds of equipment, and there's also the phone lines are now an antenna, so even the corded phones are noisy.
Yes.
But then if you talk to somebody on a cell phone, it's noisier still, which is very odd. But somehow just the other kinds of devices that people are using that are getting carried on the phone lines when you're calling, or all the other people who are using other kinds of phones in their houses who are on the same system, it increases the noise on your phone.
Yeah, I don't know about that. It is as we have these
Seems to be
digital types of phones,
Yeah.
even the signal that's coming is digital, and it's not a natural kind of signal.
Not
and
indeed.
the sounds that are made, they're trying to approximate natural sounds, but it's not natural either. So there's a lot of things in there when you go digital. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to low EMF wiring.
Yeah, there's when you're thinking about what you can do to have a more EMF-free kind of house, after you do the radio frequencies elimination, the next thing is, what are the other sources that are all electric power related, especially where you sleep? Unplugging things around you. That's just easy stuff to do. Keeping some distance from the refrigerator where you're working. After you do those kind of things, then you're starting to get to where it can be helpful to use test meters to see what's going on. For instance, you can have a wiring issue in a building that can give you very high magnetic fields, much higher than is needed for the cause of cancer in the studies. And you would never know it because it's just an electrician's wiring error. It's called stray electricity or net current. It's where electricity sometimes flows through the wrong wires. It's something I work on all the time, so I see it all the time. And electricians don't know it because it doesn't trip breakers. But electricity sometimes is going through water pipes, gas pipes, all kinds of things.
Oh dear.
So that you would find with what we call a Gauss meter. It's a meter that detects magnetic fields, and you can go to emfcenter.com and see what those are a little bit. And the other half of it is the electric field from wires and everything too, and that's where that body voltage meter can be helpful. Especially take a look at where you sleep. Test, what I like to be, if I'm sleeping, I want my voltage on my skin to be, and this is AC volts. It's the same kind of volts that when you measure the voltage, 120 volts in your wiring. The typical voltage in someone in their house is going to be half a volt, 2 volts. That's real typical. But if you really want to sleep well, I find if you get down to about 1/10 of a volt, 0.1 volt or less, that's usually pretty good for most people.
Well, it's usually best to just turn off the breaker to the bedroom, or,
yes.
or if you're doing new construction, do a kill switch.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the things, the difficulty with that is it's a good approximation to turn off the bedroom circuit. But you never know what other wires are near the bedroom. I had a client who was very EMF sensitive, and it turned out 14 circuits went right under her bed. They were feeding her house in the next unit. We're all right under her bed.
Job.
And it was just, so to get her fields low in that room, she had to turn off 14 circuits. It wasn't just her own bedroom, because everything went under her bed sort of thing.
My.
So that's where using a meter can be helpful, because you never know where the electrician ran wires, and it's easier to test. And so what you do, for instance, if you're using a body volt meter and you're in your bed and you're testing, wow, I have 3 volts on me here, that's kind of high. You go out, you turn off the power for your house. It'll probably go down to like 0.06 or something.
Yeah, you feel
really
like
low.
you're camping.
Yeah, and sensitive people will feel that. And that's also a clue. If you can turn off the power and you feel better, or if there's a power failure and you notice you like it.
Oh, most people do.
Most people do. A lot of people are kind of irritated. Oh, my freezer is warming up. But other than that, if you feel better, that's a good sign that this is important for you.
You're no kidding.
So if you do have an electric field, for instance, at your bed, and you turn off the power, then what you do is you go on, you just turn on one circuit at a time, and you find out which circuits are making that field in that room. And when you know that, you can turn those off. Typically, it's going to be that 1 or 2 breakers for that bedroom, but it could be like that client, 14. And that's a kind of a cheap way to reduce those fields, at least where you sleep.
All right, so you're designing a new house. You're
Yes.
building a house. I mean, I think the most obvious thing is that you keep all of the things that are sort of noisy, like a refrigerator, just in terms of regular fields, has usually the highest reading of anything in the house. This is not radio frequency unless you have the good luck to have one of those fancy new refrigerators with all this digital and antennas in it. So you build your kitchen and all the mechanical stuff you put in a corner of the house, and then you put your bedroom as far from there as you possibly can.
Yes.
That's number one.
Yes.
Right?
That distance, for all of these EMFs, distance is king. Often better than shielding.
What other things do you recommend?
Oh, and if you're doing some new wiring, or you're repairing or doing a remodel, rather than use Romex, you can use a shielded cable called MC cable. Electricians know about it. It's not perfect. You reduce the magnetic fields from the wiring a bit, the way that the wires inside are spun around each other, but the shielding, the armor, captures most of the electric field. Again, it's not perfect, but it's quite a reduction. If you have a normal house with Romex wiring, typically you might be sitting at a table, you might be at a volt or 2. If you have this kind of wiring, typically you'll be like 1/10 of a volt or less. And for some sensitive people, that's still not enough, but for most people, it's a drastic improvement.
Is there any reason to buy the more expensive MC shielding material? I mean, there's an aluminum one, and there's also, what is it, steel or something? And it's
right.
Somebody said that the problem is aluminum has a tendency. Can it melt in a fire? I don't know.
Oh, aluminum has probably a lower melting temperature.
Yeah. But you don't want to be in a house that's melting anyway.
Right. You'd probably want to be out. And it's usually the wiring is shot, whether it's melting or not in a fire.
Yeah, you go.
There's whether it's steel or aluminum is usually not a big difference for fields that I can measure, and usually they're kind of similar costs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What, metal roofs versus a composite roof, but having shielding in the roof, having some kind of. There's a wonderful product called Denifoil we discovered, which is a vapor barrier and a reflective barrier, so it gets the heat to come back or the cold to not. Hence, but it's an aluminum.
Blessing
sheeting.
Or curse, depending.
Well, also, as you said, if you're producing fields in the house, but what about from outside? You're trying to protect the house from fleas. You're going to tell me that it's not good to do it that way. I should have done a metal roof.
Really, it's the same thing with the shield materials.
But you've got if you've got windows for things to escape out of.
Yes. Oh, so this is where you get into the different kinds of radio frequencies. And for these digital fields, that metal in the roof or the Denifoil will tend to just reflect and be great. But when you start getting into the lower frequency radio frequencies, like AM radio signals from a radio tower, or you start to get into the electric fields from the wiring, for instance, now this metal starts to interact with it quite a lot. And so what happens is an ungrounded metal roof or ungrounded Denifoil in some cases will make the electric fields at these lower frequencies worse. There's a house in Petaluma I worked on where we did all the shielded wiring and everything was great, and then lo and behold, the upstairs had like 10 volts, and it's like, what the heck? And there's a power line outside, and it turned out that the metal insulation that he had put in was attracting the electric fields from the power line and then spreading it through the whole house. And so the way we solved that, we did some shielding with the shielded paint for some of it that we couldn't get to, but everything we could access we grounded. And then that metal became a shield rather than an amplifier for those low frequency fields.
Well, I think one of the reasons people are thinking about shielding roofs is because of we are going to cover this soon, the next wave is going to be lower satellites and drones and things delivering Wi-Fi to even remote areas where people have moved to get away from this stuff. So you think about metal in the roof. But we're getting close to running out of time. I'm just wondering if there's one last thing you want to make sure that you say. We've got about a minute left here.
Yeah, I really want to encourage people to consider that the EMFs may be affecting them more than they realize. Pay really attention to how you feel in different places. For me, it's like I go out in nature, I feel better. The power goes out, I feel better. Because if you have those kind of situations, you feel better outside or where there's less electricity or away from the Wi-Fi router. That is a big clue.
Yeah, it is.
It's hard to, there's so many fields around, it's unless you start paying attention to that. What I found when people, when I turn off the power and they realize the fields are off, or we turn off the router, then they start to get it because now you realize, the field has been reduced. A lot of people are affected that don't realize it.
Yep. So I really want to thank you, Michael, for joining us today. This was a wealth of information. Thank you so much. We'll put both of your websites on our website so people can look for that. So Michael Neuert, thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for listening. I'm Lena Berman. Visit our website, yourownhealthandfitness.org, for easier extended access to our over 500 archive shows with our library card feature. Find a stream of this week's show for free, our book, and lots more at yourownhealthandfitness.org. And if you want to reach us, please email us at admin, at yourownhealthandfitness.org. Your Own Health and Fitness is produced by Lena Berman and Dr. Jeffrey Fawcett. Remember, being informed not only protects your health, it protects your freedom.